Worked. Good afternoon. You're all the survivors who made it here on this dark and stormy day. Thanks for coming. And I just want to thank our hosts here for the kind invitation to come here. And I'm looking forward to our conversations afterwards. It's always wonderful to meet other scholars whose work you are just learning about and don't know as well. So this is a great opportunity. Even though I do not consider myself a Tocqueville scholar, it's a great opportunity to explore common themes and to bring Tocqueville back into my work a little more. My talk for today is entitled Liberty's Secrets, Counternarratives of Democratic Religion. I'm going to try the remote that Elisa handed me to see if I can make it work. I have to face this. There we go. All right. In 2006, the French author Bernard-Henri Lévy, spurred on by the Atlantic Monthly, published a travelogue that described his trip in the footsteps of Alexis de Tocqueville's famous journey across America in the early 1830s. The book was appropriately titled American Vertigo, an appellation that quite appropriately captured the dizziness that most citizens of this nation under his microscope might feel as they perused its pages. Garrison Keillor's review of the book summed up his own feeling of dislocation. It is the classic freaks, fatties, fanatics, and faux culture excursion, with stops at Las Vegas to visit a lap dancing club and a brothel, Beverly Hills, Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Graceland, a gun show in Fort Worth, Sun City, the gilded apartheid for the old, a stock car race, the Mall of America, Mount Rushmore, a couple of evangelical megachurches, the Mormons of Salt Lake, some Amish, the 2004 National Political Conventions, Alcatraz, you get the idea. This is still Keillor. You meet Sharon Stone and John Kerry and a woman who once weighed 488 pounds and an obese couple carrying rifles, but there's nobody here whom you recognize. You've lived all your life in America, never attended a megachurch or a brothel, don't own guns, are non-Amish, and it dawns on you that this is a book about the French. There's no reason for it to exist in English, except as evidence that travel need not be broadening, and one should be wary of books with Tocqueville in the title. Keillor's biting portrait illustrates what is true of all travel narratives. First, that they tell us as much, if not more, about the interests and obsessions of the author as they do about the culture being described. And second, that they are necessarily selective, partial, and idiosyncratic, revealing more about the odd and fanciful than the daily or recurring preoccupations of the locals. That is the nature of the genre. And while one might fault the author for overweening ambition, it doesn't make much sense to criticize for a lack of coverage. No one can see everything, after all. Now, today, I want to turn back from the contemporary cottage industry of Tocqueville followers. In fact, when I discovered Lévy's book, I discovered there were a lot of people who had followed in his footsteps and written about their experiences. But I want to turn back to the man himself. While I do not fancy myself the Garrison Keillor of the 1830s, I do want to spend a few minutes thinking about how a closer look at religious life might have enhanced Tocqueville's analysis. Now, my story here is not so much a criticism of Tocqueville's shortcomings or a lament about the things he might have missed in his famed sojourn across the American landscape. What does matter is Tocqueville's observations. His snapshots of the world have been frequently taken up by later authors and contemporary authors as revelations of truth about the state of American society. So from our 21st century vantage, it's useful to revisit some of his observations, to note the things that he pointedly overlooked, and to assess how subsequent appropriations of his observations may therefore mislead as much as they inform, just as going to Las Vegas does tell you something, if not everything, about American culture. American religious life was one of Tocqueville's abiding interests. The eager observer, fresh off the boat from Europe, was fascinated by the distinctive mix of liberty, piety, and equality that he found here, a combination very different from the rich Gallic stew of clerical and aristocratic authority in this homeland. He himself was ambivalent about religious piety. He gradually moved away from his Catholic upbringing to embrace a pragmatic interest in the utilitarian political aspects of faith. In the United States, he observed keenly the institutional and informal connections between religious and public life. This interest led him to many acute insights about the role of mainstream Protestantism and the transformation of Catholicism in the young nation. Tocqueville marveled at the elements of American religious life that represented what he saw as a paradox. Here was a society in which relative equality and liberty seemed to coexist with intense religious piety. So what did Tocqueville see? First of all, he saw an extension of Europe. America, in his view, contained the seeds of Europe, but had moved from an age of aristocratic privilege and monarchy into an era of democracy and equality. While not terribly pious himself, he did express confidence that humanity is caught up in what he called a grand providential plan, and that human responsibility in history now requires that we act with a view to the limits and possibilities set forth by that plan. The New England town aptly represented his view of the evolution of the legacy of European traditions into a participatory democracy governed by common morals and values. It is no coincidence that one of Tocqueville's primary interlocutors was the Unitarian minister Jared Sparks, historian and editor of the influential North American Review, and later the 17th president of Harvard University. Sparks encouraged Tocqueville to develop his thesis about the centrality of the New England town to American liberty. I wonder about that encounter sometimes, if he just himself wanted to be the center of the story, or he was so good at sort of advertising the merits of New England long before he became president of Harvard. Of course, maybe that's why he became president of Harvard, but I won't go there. Second, Tocqueville's broad narrative of American religious history began with a continent settled from east to west, from the British Protestants in New England to the later migrations of Catholics. Despite this explicit concern with geographical scope, religious affiliations started and ended with these two groups: Anglo-American Protestants and European Catholic immigrants. On that basis, he could then generalize about the close relationship between religious affiliation and political opinions. Protestants, who arrived first, had espoused a democratic Republican faith. They were, as he saw it, naturally anti-authoritarian because they had crossed the ocean to shake off the influence of the Pope, and their egalitarian political worldview set the standard for American public life. Interestingly, though, Tocqueville observed that despite natural inclinations toward authoritarianism, American Catholics seemed equally or even more enthusiastic about democracy than did the Protestants. He attributed this to the fact that if you looked closer, and of course he himself, having been raised Catholic, was a little closer to that experience as well, so it's hard not to see him looking with a keener eye on the Catholic situation perhaps than the Protestant. But if he looked, as he looked more closely, he could see that the Catholic understanding of authority was much more complicated than one might assume. Ordinary Catholics, as he saw it, believe in equality of condition below the level of the priesthood, so that even though there's this big hierarchy, he argued, it's a hierarchy where there's a huge chasm between the leaders of the church and everyone underneath. That means that all the people at the bottom feel more equal to one another. So it leads to a more egalitarian ethos. So he therefore sort of explains away the more evident characteristics of Catholic authority because he himself brings to it a different kind of knowledge of the workings of individual Catholic souls. So it's an insight I think he doesn't have with reference to other groups in the society. More important, though, than Christian sectarianism for Tocqueville was that different groups shared a common morality. Provided the citizens profess a religion, the particular tenets of that religion are of very little importance to its interests. Now, this reminds me of what someone's going to correct me, but was it Eisenhower in the 50s who said, you know, it's basically every American has to have a religion, and I don't really care which one it is. So religion in and of itself is a good thing. This is sort of an old strain in American religious life. It was that shared understanding, as Tocqueville saw it, of the intertwining of equality and liberty under the rubric of Christian morality that mattered most. Third, Tocqueville seemed most taken with the discovery that in America, piety and liberty seemed to march hand in hand. His assumption, drawn from his experiences in France, was that intense piety and increased clerical authority were never accompanied by great freedom. In the United States, he marveled at how the two could be united. There, religion could become a force for moral order. Americans exercised natural habits of restraint, as he saw it. They were counseled by their churches, and that led to both social tranquility and institutional durability. Whilst the law permits the Americans to do what they please, he observed, religion prevents them from conceiving and forbids them to commit what is rash or unjust. In this last point, Tocqueville's interest in social stability becomes clear. Although he was stimulated by the excitement of American innovation, particularly in things like voluntary associations, he loved the fact that Americans were always banding together and starting some new group. He marveled at the fact that zeal was moderated by the structure of democracy. So that, in other words, what could look really scary, meaning religious energy, wasn't. It wasn't really scary because somehow it was moderated in this particular formation. Stability would endure, despite, or even better and more surprisingly, because of American liberty. Religious believers exhibited an energy tempered by patriotism, as he saw it. He presciently acknowledged those New Englanders who left their homes and struck out westward to Missouri and Illinois in order to lay Christian foundations. As he put it, thus religious zeal is perpetually stimulated in the United States by the duties of patriotism. Now, Tocqueville was not unaware of the abundance of religious zeal of the day. He arrived in the United States at the height of an intense spiritual excitement known as the Second Great Awakening, a fact that led to his acknowledgement that religious insanity is very common in the United States. He believed that it arose out of economic abundance. It was a logical result of the striving for material status that met up with the ultimate meaninglessness of such activity in the face of existential reality. So somewhere along the line, people striving for more and more goods realized that it was all for naught, and this translated itself into a religious enthusiasm. So that anxiety and alienation were transformed into a world of mystical piety and zeal. What he didn't observe, though, is just as telling as what he did see. Let's take the year 1831-32, for example, when he and his traveling companion, Gustave Beaumont, were busy interviewing hundreds of Americans that they met from New England to Alabama. The summer and fall of 1831 had witnessed one of the largest and most violent slave uprisings ever recorded, as the self-proclaimed Christian prophet Nat Turner led a rampage of several dozen co-conspirators across Northampton County, Virginia, that led to the massacre of men, women, and children. Now, to be fair, Tocqueville did not claim to explain plantation slavery in his ruminations. He said, I don't understand it. It's not something I used to. I'm not really going to talk about it. And he did talk about his generalizations as being, I think, most relevant to the situation in the northern states. So let's look at Boston. In Boston, a city where the French visitors spent a large amount of time among the upper classes, a woman named Ara Stewart delivered the first of a series of addresses that year that argued for the abolition of slavery and helped to fan the flames of that movement for the first time. What made her speeches so remarkable was that she was the first African-American woman to speak publicly before what were at the time called promiscuous assemblies, meaning assemblies of both men and women. Women were not at the time supposed to be speaking in front of male audiences, but also blacks and whites, so they were mixed audiences. Stewart spoke as an Old Testament prophet, calling down the wrath of God on the heads of white Americans who espoused liberty and equality, but who treated blacks as second-class citizens in the North, enslaved them in the South, and who would pay for their sins. In March of that same year, the Mormon leader Joseph Smith, Jr., who had published the Book of Mormon several years earlier and subsequently had fled with his followers from New York to Ohio, was beaten, tarred, and feathered by a crowd for the religious beliefs he espoused. Within a few years, his movement would grow to thousands of believers, but would be forced into exile in Missouri and Illinois, the same states, in fact, that Tocqueville mentioned earlier, that I mentioned of Tocqueville's earlier. He was forced into exile by Protestant Americans who clearly had not met with Tocqueville or heard about the stabilizing influence of democratic piety. Religious violence, religiously inspired unrest. Did Tocqueville miss these events? Yes and no. And I can't say, I'm not a Tocqueville scholar, I'm not going to be the one to say why he left these out. That seems to me up to scholars who know his work together and can speculate about those things, or maybe we can talk about some of those issues. But it seems to me that he actually could have used some of those events and perhaps his ruminations on them to further his arguments. He was in Ohio, he discussed revivalism, and he even spent time watching Shakers dance and sing, an event he found singularly odd. He certainly recognized the potential for what he saw as religious enthusiasms. And this was, if nothing else, a period of remarkable ferment and religious zeal, a moment that gave rise to movements that, while they may have seemed anomalous when placed alongside the many Protestant denominational enterprises and voluntary associations, would prove to be incredibly important for the future of the nation. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking what an alternative tour, if I had set up an alternative tour for Tocqueville, what would that have looked like? What would I have wanted him to see? Well, surely it would have noticed the two developments that I've alluded to above. The growth of African American religious life and public protest, which culminated in the abolitionist movement, and the emergence of Mormonism, a movement that can be seen as a third Christian impulse that resided between the egalitarian piety, as he saw it, of the Protestants on the one hand, and the sacramental authoritarianism of Catholicism. Not only would some understanding of these developments have added texture to Tocqueville's portrait, but they also could have aided and complicated his arguments about the nature of American religion. So first, the African Americans. Interestingly, Tocqueville talked about race, and he talked about slavery. What he didn't discuss, though, were the communities, including churches and voluntary associations, that hundreds of thousands of free blacks were building in the northern states by the 1820s and 1830s. And the only way I can understand this, and I promised I wouldn't speculate about Tocqueville, but I will just for a second, is that somehow this occupied, the talk about slavery and race occupied a different space in his brain than a discussion of Protestants. And so he did not understand that these African Americans were also Protestants and were also engaged in the same kinds of voluntary activities that white Protestants were engaged in. Beginning in the 1780s, in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Charleston, African Americans organized themselves into groups, prayed and sang, celebrated holidays, buried their dead, ran schools, and built societies that in many ways paralleled the world of Anglo-Americans that surrounded them. They were still second-class citizens in most states. They were not equal, but they were relatively free, and most definitely they were pious. They could not attend public schools or serve on juries or join many associations, but many of them were Protestants, primarily Baptists and Methodists. By 1800, approximately 1/4 of all American Methodists were of African descent. But if the struggle for Tocqueville was to figure out how Americans were juggling the freedoms of equality with the disciplines of religious piety, African Americans had to negotiate the treacherous terrain of inequality and religious belief. They too believed in the promise of American democracy, and they proclaimed its value on occasion after occasion. But they had to reconcile that promise with the realities of life as second-class citizens. The miracle in this case, although Tocqueville could not see it, was that they retained their Christian beliefs in equality and their faith in the potential for their nation, despite living in a situation of inequality. Now, Maria Stewart, the woman I mentioned, whoops, I knew that would happen. Maria Stewart is a great example of this. I mentioned her earlier as the woman who spoke in Boston in 1832. She was thoroughly steeped in biblical language, and she was trying to help African Americans form voluntary associations that would aid their cause and energize their ability to participate in a democratic society. But she's also quite revolutionary in her tone, as you can tell from this piece, when she is sort of citing biblical references to sort of prophetic callings for what do not look to be sort of stability and status quo. It appears to me that America has become like the great city of Babylon, for she has boasted in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow and shall see no sorrow. She is indeed a seller of slaves and the souls of men. She has made the Africans drunk with the wine of her fornication. She has put them completely beneath her feet, and she means to keep them there. Her right hand supports the reins of government and her left hand the wheel of power, and she is determined not to let go her grasp. Needless to say, she was not always a popular speaker in Boston. In fact, got drummed out of Boston and headed down to Washington, D.C. after a while, but was quite inflamed a lot of passion with her speeches. One of her closest friends, furthermore, was a man named David Walker, another African Methodist and Bostonian who penned an address to Southern slaves in the late 1820s. And in that work, Walker both pledged allegiance to the values of equality and liberty, but castigated American whites for their failure to live up to their own ideals. Walker's work was certainly considered revolutionary by Southern standards, but by 1830, many whites in the North were beginning to agree that slavery was a barbaric system that needed to be dismantled. Increasingly, African Americans, especially those in Protestant churches, argued for a patriotic form of Christianity that placed all Americans on an equal footing. But they did so in a way that both challenged and reinforced some of Tocqueville's observations about the relationship between piety and liberty. The most visible example of this reformulation of patriotism and religious energy can be seen in the celebration of the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. Until at least the 1830s, so surely Tocqueville might have come across one of these celebrations somewhere along the way. Until at least the 1830s, blacks and sympathetic whites in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia crowded into churches annually to hear speakers relate the long history of the slave trade, express gratitude to the abolitionist cause, and hail the continued march of emancipation as part of the progress of divine providence. Participants hewed to the form for public commemorations that had become standard in the United States by the early 19th century. A parade followed by a service that included a benediction, prayers, the singing of hymns, and a public speech. Some of the orations were given by whites, but the majority of sermons were delivered by African American clergy. Even as these commemorations reflected assimilation to broader American patterns, and in this case would have reinforced some of Tocqueville's generalizations, they exhibited simultaneously a distinctive ordering of time and space within free black communities. These occasions allowed blacks a time of relative freedom, fueled by dancing, eating, and drinking. In the early national era, public commemorations of the end of the slave trade brought celebrations into the center of urban public life, incorporating sympathetic whites and announcing the presence and unity of African Americans. Beginning in this era, but continuing right up to the time of the Revolution, free blacks expressed their own, to the Civil War, I should have, to the Civil War. Free blacks expressed their own civil religion, an alternative calibration of freedom and equality that was rooted in Protestantism, but that challenged the generalizations offered by Tocqueville's glimpses of white Protestant institutions. What is intriguing is that if Tocqueville had been able to recognize the distinctive claims of black Protestants, he might have found there further evidence for the resiliency and energy of democracy. Even those most disposed to reject the American political system had found a way to embrace its ideals. Yet abolitionist ideology was also a tradition laced with revolutionary fervor and religious zeal, one that could erupt occasionally in the spasms of violence of Nat Turner or John Brown. And it was a tradition that, in the longer run, catalyzed the Civil War. Now, the Mormons, on the other hand, represent another and very different example of how liberty and piety could intermingle in the United States. I'm going to say much less about them, but I just wanted to bring them into the conversation. Unlike African Americans, most followers of Joseph Smith, Jr., who took up his call to gather for the coming millennium in the 1830s, were white Americans. They may have been down on their luck, but they were not disenfranchised. And they created a religious tradition that reasserted certain kinds of sacramentalism, not unlike the Catholic ritual that Tocqueville thought would fade away with the close of the aristocratic phase of Europe, as well as a certain kind of hierarchy. Now, it's hard to sum up Mormonism in any brief way. In the years following the church's organization in 1830, Joseph Smith and his followers created a religious institutional life that attempted to restore all of the elements of Hebrew and early Christian ritual life that had been lost over the 14th century since the deaths of the last true followers of Christ on the American continent. People they believed had lived on the American continent up until about 400 AD, known as the Nephites. If Tocqueville understood United States society as emerging from European roots, the Mormons were a seed that had fallen very far from the tree. Indeed, they renounced their roots in Europe altogether as hopelessly corrupt, embracing an understanding of Christianity that borrowed directly from early American and Middle Eastern peoples. But like African Americans, And like many mainline Protestants, Mormons also exhibited a dedication to many of the principles that Tocqueville found so alluring. They were just arrayed in a different configuration. Like the Catholics, the Mormon collective world was characterized by an authoritarian leadership with control and with all church-related revelations communicated by the prophet. But at the family and individual level, one also found a tenacious commitment to the primacy of individual agency and equality before God. Indeed, within the movement of the 1830s, those counterposed ideals often warred with one another. Many faithful Mormons left the fold because they disagreed with the way that Joseph Smith was exercising undue control. But likely, they also worked in some ways, Tocqueville claimed, that Catholicism did. In other words, there was sort of an utter equality underneath the hierarchy of sorts. So there are some interesting comparisons I think he might have been able to make if he had been around to see the development of that religious movement. Now, like the Catholics, Mormons also elicited violent opposition at every turn from members of Protestant sects. Anti-Mormon actions from tarring and feathering Smith to assassinating him in 1844, to declarations of extermination and outright war by the federal government, and later to the dedicated effort to eliminate plural marriage as a legitimate religious choice, characterized the sedate, harmonious Protestant sects that Tocqueville prized as tolerant to a fault. Like the fate of David Walker, who was murdered for his pamphlet to the slaves, the reaction to Mormonism by Protestants represents a pattern that does not fit neatly into Tocqueville's categories. Now, one commonality, I think, that links these alternate events of the 1830s together is the element of social dislocation they represent. Both Maria Stewart and Joseph Smith, Jr. represent the experiences of many Americans who were dislocated in the 1830s, either forced into legal dislocation by virtue of their race, as in the case of Stewart, or exiled geographically because of their religious claims, like Smith and his followers. One of the dominant motifs, in fact, I think, of 19th century literature is mobility and the concomitant destabilization that it entails. One might think that Tocqueville, a dislocated Frenchman and traveler, would be attentive to the effects of feeling out of place. Ironically, however, his aphorisms are quite static. He reifies American society through his work, providing the reader with snapshots rather than videos, images that express his own intense desire for a solid, stable moral foundation. Again, so much for me not speculating about his motives, but I can't resist at certain points to wonder why it is that he seems so much to desire. I know why he might desire that stability, but I think it leads him not to see certain things that are right in front of him. For all of his traveling, then, Tocqueville might not have fully comprehended the power of social dislocation in the religious experience of American life. Yet it is precisely those groups, Mormons and African Americans among others, that catalyzed some of the most important events of 19th century American religious history. Tocqueville's partial view of American religious life and the irresistible desire to generalize from that vantage led him to misguided conclusions about the easy and stabilizing fit between American liberty and religious faith. It wasn't altogether wrong, I would say, but it was only a partial picture. His opinions had hints of truth in them, but they could not bear the analytical weight that so many scholars have placed on them in succeeding generations. With respect to religion, Tocqueville's narrow vision simply could not predict the many religious upheavals that upended American society in the mid-19th century, and which led in part to the crisis of the Civil War that nearly ended the American experiment. As Cushing-Strout noted, As Cushing-Strout noted, for all its cogency, Tocqueville's theory of American religion as a moderating force, however true of mainline churches, does not quite prepare us for the millennial expectations found in Nat Turner's slave revolt, or in the religious passion burning within that little bit of a woman, somewhat more than 40, about as thin and dry as a pinch of snuff, as she spoke of herself, who enthralled millions with Uncle Tom's Cabin, or the faith in the coming kingdom that inspired some religious believers to see its foreshadowing in the Liberty Party, the Populist Party, the Socialist Party, the Prohibition Movement, or in Woodrow Wilson's War to End War and Make the World Safe for Democracy through a League of Nations. As with all travel writings, then, we should take Tocqueville's observations as invitations to reflection and investigation, not as timeless truths to be memorialized. Thank you.